Case 1. Shedrick Harmon. Shedrick Harmon was 44 years old. In his corner of Decatur, Georgia, he was the kind of man people set their week by. Steady, present, reliable. A husband. A familiar face in the neighborhood. He shared a home in DeKalb County with his wife, Yesha. From the outside, their marriage looked like any other. Inside its walls, something had been coming apart for a long time. It ended in the early morning hours of September 19, 2022. At around 3:05 a.m., Yesha Harmon called 911 from their home on Charleston Terrace. She told the dispatcher she had shot her husband and that it was an accident. When DeKalb County officers arrived, they found Shedrick with a gunshot wound to his upper right torso. He was rushed to the hospital. He did not survive. The story Yesha told investigators was one of terrible misfortune. There had been no argument, she said. 2 guns and a pile of unfolded laundry were on the bed, and as she moved one of the firearms, it simply went off. It was a portrait of domestic clutter, not domestic violence, and at first, the system took her at her word. She was charged with involuntary manslaughter, released on a $10,000 bond, and sent home. For more than 500 days, the case went quiet. But inside the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office, under DA Sherry Boston and the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Unit, investigators kept pulling at the threads. Search warrants brought in the couple's phones, and the digital trail told a story the accident narrative never could. Text messages, statements from friends and family, a relationship marked by drug use, by infidelity, and by a documented history of Yesha threatening Shedrick with a gun, more than once. What had been filed away as a freak accident now looked like the culmination of a pattern no one had stopped. On January 23, 2024, a grand jury returned a new indictment, this time for malice murder. By then, Yesha was gone. She was captured weeks later in Phoenix City, Alabama, arrested as a fugitive by the U.S. Marshals Service alongside local authorities, and booked into the Russell County Jail to await extradition. On December 1, 2025, the case reached its end. Yesha Harmon pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, along with 2 firearm counts, including possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. A 2009 drug conviction had made it unlawful for her to have those weapons in the home at all. DeKalb County Superior Court Judge Courtney Johnson sentenced her to 30 years. Voluntary manslaughter alone carries a maximum of 20, but by stacking the firearm counts on top, the court made certain those illegal guns carried their full weight. Shedrick Harmon's death asks us to sit with an uncomfortable truth, the danger of a pattern we talk ourselves out of seeing. Researchers who study intimate partner violence, including the landmark work behind the danger assessment, have found that when a firearm enters an abusive relationship, the risk of a partner being killed rises roughly 5-fold. A gun raised in anger is never only a threat. Too often, it is a rehearsal. And the accident story, a weapon tucked among the laundry, is its own kind of tell. It tries to dress a killing up as household chaos, to strip a gun of its meaning by burying it in the ordinary. But history and ballistics tend to agree on one thing. A firearm does not fire itself simply because it is being moved. Shedrick deserved to be believed while he was still here to be protected. His story is a reminder, for neighbors, for families, and for the systems meant to catch these things early. A threat made with a weapon is never just talk. It is a roadmap. And reading it early, taking it seriously, is the only thing that can change where it leads. If you recognize this pattern in your own life or in someone you love, please reach out. Help is there, and you are not alone. Case 2. Robert Guzman. Robert Guzman built his life in Leesburg, Georgia, a quiet stretch of South Philema Road, steady work, and a family he came home to every night. Firearms were simply part of the household. He and his wife, Sherry, shot together for sport. A gun in the home was familiar, unremarkable. Until one night, it wasn't. On the night of July 31st, 2020, shortly before midnight, a single shot rang out inside the house. Robert was rushed to Phoebe Putney Memorial Hospital in nearby Albany. He did not survive. The account Sherry gave Lee County deputies was simple: a terrible accident. But when the Georgia Bureau of Investigation examined the scene, the physical evidence sat uneasily against that story. Sherry Guzman was arrested and charged in her husband's death. It would take nearly 6 years for the case to reach a jury. When the trial opened in March of 2026, the marriage prosecutors described was not a peaceful one. Robert's daughter testified that the couple argued at times, recalling an occasion when Sherry used a slur against her father. Then came the testimony that shifted the room. A fellow inmate, Tony Rizzo, held near Sherry before trial, told the court she had confided something chilling. According to Rizzo, Sherry said she had given her husband what he deserved, that she'd been cheated on, and that in shooting him, he got what was coming. Rizzo was serving time himself, and the defense pressed him on whether he'd been promised anything for his account. He said he had not. When Sherry took the stand in her own defense, she offered the jury a story built on uncertainty. The couple, she said, had been watching a program that touched on reincarnation when a comment from Robert cut deep. She testified that she had long struggled with depression and anxiety, that she went to the bedroom intending to take her own life, and that the gun went off in a moment her memory could no longer reach. Under cross-examination, she would not commit to what happened. Did she point the gun at Robert? I wouldn't have done that. Was it pointed at herself? That's possible. Did he grab it? That's also possible. What actually happened? I don't remember. It's a possibility. Then the jury did something rarely seen. Before reaching a verdict, they sent a request to Judge Jimmy Brown: remove the safety zip tie from the firearm so they could handle it in the deliberation room. They wanted to feel the trigger themselves, to measure possibility against the physical reality of the weapon. In less than 2 hours, they returned guilty of felony murder and aggravated assault. Sherry Guzman stood stoic as Judge Brown sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole. The Guzman case is, in the end, a study in the limits of a fluid story. A genuine memory blackout tends to leave a hard, defined edge. What the jury heard instead was something looser, an account that seemed to bend around whatever the evidence demanded, answering each hard question with a soft, "It's possible." And because the Guzmans were known as a shooting family, that ambiguity may have been meant to pass as ordinary. But when a person's words refuse to hold a shape, a jury reaches for something that does. They reached for the machine. A firearm demands deliberate, specific pressure to fire, a fact no hypothetical can soften. Memory can be reshaped. It can be hidden behind a convenient blank. But the mechanics of a weapon cannot be talked out of the truth. Robert Guzman mattered: a father, a husband, a man his family still grieves. And in the end, it was the cold certainty of physics that spoke for him, when every other answer was only possible. Case 3, Mark Muse. Mark Muse was 39 years old, and by the end of 2008, he was trying to end his marriage the hard way, honestly. When his wife, Beth Ann, discovered he'd been unfaithful, Mark didn't hide it. He agreed to counseling, but he told her a truth she didn't want to hear. He intended to stay with the other woman. On the day after Christmas, he told Beth Ann he was leaving for good. 7 days later, he was dead. It happened in the early morning hours of January 2, 2009, inside the couple's Walton County, Georgia home. When deputies arrived around 3 a.m., Beth Ann Muse admitted she had pulled the trigger. She told them it was self-defense, that Mark had assaulted her, and that she had fired a .40 caliber handgun in terror, fighting for her life. But the room told a different story. Forensic reconstruction found no signs of a struggle and no defensive injuries on Beth Ann. Mark was shot in the chest, and then a second time, fatally, and as he lay on the floor, No longer able to harm anyone, several more rounds were fired into him. This was not the chaos of a desperate fight. It had the order of an execution. And then investigators found the timeline that dismantled her defense entirely. The day after Mark said he was leaving, Beth Ann called the Walton County Sheriff's Office to report a burglar. Sergeant Joseph Broccoli responded. The master bedroom looked ransacked, yet jewelry and firearms sat untouched, in plain sight. The intruder she described matched a suspicious man a neighbor had reported weeks earlier. The next morning, she drove herself to a hospital, claiming her husband had slipped her a date rape drug. And under the cover of that invented break-in, she asked the sergeant about the law, about a homeowner's right to use deadly force against an intruder. She wasn't reporting a threat, she was building a story. At her 2011 trial, Beth Ann argued the killing was justified, self-defense against an assault she said happened that night. The prosecution laid out the opposite, a death that was planned, not provoked. The jury took less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts: malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Judge John Ott sentenced her to life in prison plus 5 years. The Muse case holds a warning that runs against our instincts. We tend to assume that once someone decides to leave, the danger fades. Research on intimate partner violence shows the opposite. The risk to a partner doesn't peak when an affair is exposed or when the arguments are loudest. It peaks at the moment of departure, the instant one person says, out loud, that it's over. For someone whose sense of control depends on that relationship staying intact, a hollow marriage can be endured. A declared ending cannot. Everything Beth Ann did in those final days, the staged burglary, the hospital visit, the careful questions about self-defense law, was not the behavior of someone in fear. It was the groundwork of someone building permission, in advance, for something she had already decided to do. Mark Muse tried to leave with honesty, and it cost him his life. His story is a hard reminder that the most dangerous moment in a collapsing relationship is often not the secret, and not the argument. It is the declaration that it's finally over. If you, or someone you love, is preparing to leave a relationship and something feels unsafe, please treat that instinct seriously and reach out for help. That moment deserves a plan and support. Case 4. Phil Fedrick. Phil Fedrick was 40 years old, a husband and father in Thomas County, Georgia, living a life so steady it was almost unremarkable. On a Friday night in September 2021, he sat in the stands at a high school football game with his kids. Saturday, he worked his shift at the local bakery. By every account, he was a healthy man. Within days, he would be dead, and the cause would be one of the quietest weapons imaginable. It started on Sunday, when Phil began to feel unwell and kept to his bedroom. The family shared a Sunday lunch. Phil ate alone in his room. There was a drink his wife, Tori, had made specially for him. By Monday morning, he was in crisis, found unconscious, undressed, face down in a bathtub with no water in it, his organs already failing. He was rushed to Archbold Memorial Hospital. And there, emergency staff noticed something that didn't fit an ordinary illness. They suspected poisoning, and they alerted authorities. A week later, Phil died. An autopsy confirmed what the doctors feared: ethylene glycol, the toxic chemical found in antifreeze and brake fluid. It's a poison that hides well. It doesn't show up on routine hospital screens, and its early effects can mimic any severe illness. Without the vigilance of that ER staff, Phil's death might have been quietly filed away as organ failure, and nothing more. The investigation stretched more than a year. Tori Fedrick was arrested in November 2022, and her trial opened in March 2025. The state's case was circumstantial. Investigators never recovered the drink or the antifreeze itself. What they had was access. Prosecutors argued that Tori had mixed the poison into a drink she prepared for her husband, in the one place he had no reason to be on guard, his own home. As the lead prosecutor put it, poison is the way a weaker person kills a stronger one. The defense told a different story, that Phil, privately struggling, had taken the antifreeze himself. Even the couple's own children testified for their mother. But the prosecution pointed to the scene that suicide could not explain: a man found undressed and unconscious in an empty dry tub, and a wife who, when he was rushed to the hospital that way, never asked for an investigation. On March 27, 2025, the jury convicted Tori Fedrick of malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. Superior Court Judge Gregory Voiles sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole. The Fedrick case is a study in the quietest kind of harm. Most of the violence we fear is loud: a weapon, a struggle, a moment of rage. Poison is the opposite. It turns the safest corners of a life, a home-cooked meal, a glass handed to you by someone you trust, into the delivery system. It asks little of the one who uses it but patience and proximity, and it lets the body do the rest, disguising a killing as misfortune. That is what makes it so dangerous and so easy to miss. Phil Fedrick's death was very nearly explained away as a medical mystery. In the end, what gave him justice wasn't the poison revealing itself. It was a nurse, a doctor, an investigator who refused to accept the easy answer when a healthy man collapsed without warning. And that refusal is the whole lesson. When something doesn't fit, the most important thing anyone can do is keep asking why. Luke Coe, Gary Ferris, George Young, Jake Embert, Shedrick Harmon, Robert Guzman, Mark Muse, Phil Fedrick. 8 men, 8 Georgia marriages, 8 verdicts handed down in courtrooms that, in some cases, took years to reach the truth. Across this series, we never lingered on the question of how each man died. The courts settled that. The harder question, the one that stays with you, is quieter. It belongs to the people who stood closest to each of these marriages, what they saw, what they sensed, whether they let themselves name it or looked away. Because that is where these stories truly turn. Not on the weapon, or the poison, or the staged accident, but on the small, human moments of recognition that again and again decide the distance between a life protected and a life lost. And it would be a disservice to reduce these 8 men to the case files they left behind. They were not evidence. They were husbands, fathers, the steady ones, the people their families leaned on, the quiet anchors of ordinary lives built on work and patience and love. They can no longer benefit from being seen clearly. The rest of us still can. So we refuse to let their names dissolve into ambiguity or shrink into a statistic. We choose to remember them for how they lived, not only for how they were taken from the people who loved them. And to the families still carrying the silent daily weight of that absence, we wish you a peace that holds, a justice that stays whole, and room, at last, to heal. The Georgia series ends here. Thank you for sitting with these stories. And thank you for honoring the men whose names we spoke.